Okay, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are today, and welcome to today's School for CEOs webinar on the psychological impact of COVID-19, where we'll be discussing our research exploring how senior leaders in business have been affected by lockdown. It's amazing to think that it's 7 months now since the World Health Organization first declared COVID-19 a pandemic. And it's been a long journey since the 11th of March when they made that pronouncement. Many countries in turn have taken drastic measures to try and reduce the transmission of this virus. And for us in the UK, that meant a forced lockdown from the 23rd of March. So forcing many organisations to shut up shop and many leaders and employees to set up new professional and domestic routines simultaneously. And while the government have been quick to set up stimulus packages to protect employment and to support the economy, we wondered what have been the hidden costs of the pandemic and of lockdown. How have senior leaders been affected? So my name is Gemma Seoul. I'm a director at School for CEOs, and I'll be hosting a webinar today. And with me, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Mioara Cristea. Mioara is the Programme Director of the Business Psychology MSc as part of the School of Social Sciences at Heriot University and was our research partner for this study. This is the second time we've actually collaborated together. So we're delighted to be working with you again, Mioara. And perhaps you'd like to just introduce yourself briefly by sharing, I suppose, your personal interest in burnout among senior leaders, particularly in the context of the pandemic.
Hello, Gemma. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Gemma. As you said, my name is Mioara Cristea. I'm a social psychologist. I'm a doctor in social psychology, and I'm currently running the business psychology master program at Heriot. As a researcher in social or organizational psychology, you're usually taught to make sense of the world around you. You become curious about how people's behaviors change within different contexts, and particularly within such an unexpected context, which is a worldwide pandemic. Before the pandemic, I used to appreciate those days when I would work from home. I would call them my home working days. No need for the long commute. No need to spend time trying to prepare myself to go to work. I could just go for a run in the morning and then work until late. I feel like my schedule was quite flexible, and for some reason, I feel like I was much more efficient at working at home than in my own office. But having said that, the lockdown came, and every day became a working from home. So again, no more commuting, no more needing to prepare myself, sharing a space with my partner, which is always nice to have around. Yet somehow it didn't feel like I was as efficient as I used to be. And it definitely didn't feel as flexible as it seemed to feel before the pandemic. And so I became interested about the impact of lockdown on working from home. What really happens when we blur the limits of your personal and your professional space? And how do we deal with that? Are we still efficient during those times? Are we becoming less efficient? Why are we becoming less efficient? And how do we manage to actually limit the space or define a space that used to be a personal space now into both a personal but also a professional time space? So I guess my interest in this research was more about seeing how the lockdown impacts on our professional life, on our personal life as well, but also most importantly on our psychological well-being, and whether, you know, by being all the time connected on our Teams and on Skype, trying to have as much online connection with our colleagues so that we keep that sense of being a professional, does somehow impact on us and brings more exhaustion that we imagined before. So you could say that I was interested in demystifying the whole idea of working from home is great in a way. anyway.
Thank you, Mioara. And just to pick up on your comment around blurring professional and personal boundaries, Mioara messaged me just before we started broadcasting to say that her cat was now snoring in the background. And I'm pleased just to share with you, Mioara, we can't hear your cat snoring, so that's good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mioara. We also have joining us today David Seoul, who's the School for CEO's co-founder and managing partner. David has been supporting senior leaders through executive coaching for 20 years now, helping them deal with live challenges and crises, including the dot-com bubble burst in the early noughties and also the financial crash in 2008. So lots of experience supporting leaders through challenges, though none quite like these. David, you commissioned this research as managing partner of the school. So why did you feel it was so important?
Thank you, Gemma. I think there are three things that really piqued our interest. I think, firstly, the mental health agenda is rising up the profile and sense of importance in organizations, rightly so. And understanding how people had coped through an extraordinary period of lockdown was of great interest, and understanding how resilient they were was of real interest to us. I think the second thing that was particularly interesting, I think there's been quite a lot of research done at lower levels in organizations to see how kind of the wider working population has coped with lockdown. But as far as we were aware, this was the first piece of work which really focused on the C-suite. So we wanted to really understand how business leaders, chief executives, executive teams, and their direct reports were coping with this extraordinary situation that we have found ourselves in. And thirdly, I think it was trying to understand how people managed and what coping mechanisms they had found the most useful and the most supportive. Because I think if we can share that information and sort of broadcast that more widely, that then becomes a useful resource to organizations and to senior leaders throughout a wide range of organizations.
Thank you. In terms of the format for today's 1 hour webinar, I'll be starting by taking you through the main findings of our research. So who we were interested in learning from, how we conducted the research, but importantly, what we found. And as David just touched on there, what helped senior leaders through lockdown. For the second half of the webinar, we'll be reintroducing David and Mioara to gain their insights and their perspectives on the research. So we'll be having an open panel discussion there. So we've referenced the term burnout a couple of times now, but I think before we start looking at our results, it's important that we are clear about exactly what we mean by the term of burnout. And this definition that we have on the screen now is commonly cited in psychology. It's the progressive loss of idealism, energy, and purpose as a result of work conditions. And underpinning the syndrome of burnout are two key facets that you can see also on your screen. When we look at disengagement with work, that refers specifically to a negative attitude towards work. And thinking about exhaustion, that's about emotional exhaustion. So that's thinking about not how you feel after going for a run. So it's not that physical exhaustion, but it's that emotional weariness. Okay, and these are a couple of terms that we'll be referring to throughout the data. So, who took part? Here's a quick snapshot of who took part in the study. We had over 700 participants, many more male than female participants, as you can see with the percentages there. We had quite a broad range in age. So the youngest participant was 24, and that went up to age 68. And we were focused, as David said, on the most senior leaders in business. So we shared the survey with CEOs, executive level leaders, and then the execs teams as well. If you look at the graph on the bottom right, the very colourful one, you can see the range of different sectors that took part in the study. And these sectors represent different types of organisations. So we had a mixture of publicly and privately owned organisations, and a small number of family-owned businesses and public sector organisations as well. All participants completed exactly the same survey, and that questionnaire drew on a number of different scales, and those scales measured burnout, resilience, leadership style, and positive and negative emotions. And we supplemented these scales with our own questions to help understand specific lockdown experiences. So they picked up on things like employment status and living status, and also, importantly, as David's already mentioned, the resources and coping strategies that leaders used to help them deal with the isolation of lockdown. So what did we learn? What did the data say? The first finding that we'll share is really the most important and really quite shocking, but 42% of senior leaders who took part in the study were at a high risk of burnout. So if you think about that, that's 2 in 5 of your senior leaders were at a high risk of burnout. So maybe just take a moment to think about who that might have been in your team and how that might have affected your ability as a team to lead your organization. Very small number, by contrast, were at a low risk of burnout, 6%. Looking a little bit deeper into the data, we made some interesting findings around gender to begin with. As you can see on these two comparators, women scored slightly higher on burnout risk than men did, with 7% more women scoring in that high category than men. So we wanted to understand that data a little bit better, and so we started to look at our different scales. The first one was emotions, and the scale we used looked at 11 different emotions, 6 of them positive, 5 negative. And as you can see them listed there below, they're a mixture of high energy and low energy emotions. What we found quite quickly was that women experience more negative emotions and fewer positive emotions than men throughout lockdown. And this is just how they felt in general. It's not how they felt in the context of their work. But where we saw the most stark differences were on these 3 emotions here. So feeling exhausted and anxious. Women felt a lot more exhausted and anxious than their male colleagues. And also men felt a lot calmer than their female colleagues. And those feelings of exhaustion and anxiety were highest actually among women aged 24 to 38 years old. When we looked at overall burnout, you've seen already that there were 7% more women in the high category than there were men. However, statistically speaking, that difference was not significant. When we then looked at the 2 facets that underpin burnout, there wasn't a significant difference when we reviewed the disengagement from work, so that negative attitude towards work. And that was quite interesting because you would expect women to be more disengaged from work, given that they'd experienced more negative emotions than their male colleagues. However, that negative feeling in general did not transfer into a negative attitude towards work. So that was interesting. But where we did find the greatest difference was actually when we looked at emotional exhaustion. And here, women scored significantly higher than men did. So wanting to understand this data point better around emotional exhaustion, we had another dig, and we had a look at living status. So firstly, we noticed more men were living with school-age children than women. However, 1 in 4 female participants took full responsibility for homeschooling their children versus 3% of male participants. Bearing in mind these are senior leaders in business taking on a huge amount of responsibility already, it was quite staggering that 1 in 4 female leaders were also taking full homeschooling responsibility as well. We then went on to have a look at age and find some interesting discoveries here as well. Here, when we looked at age, we found that the younger leaders were at a much, much higher risk of burnout than more mature leaders. So when we talked about overall 2 in 5 senior leaders being at high risk of burnout, when you isolate that by age, 3 in 5 younger leaders were at a high risk of burnout. And I think this is interesting because actually, when you think about our over 50s, they were at the lowest risk of burnout, but also amid the broader context of a pandemic, they are the individuals that are at a higher risk of contracting COVID, or if they were to contract COVID, would have a higher risk in terms of their overall health. As you know, we looked at different levels of leadership, so we also drew some analyses by senior leadership level. Here we were quite surprised again to see that CEOs were at the lowest risk of burnout compared to their teams and their teams. So when overall 2 in every 5 senior leaders were at high risk of burnout, when you looked at and isolated the CEOs, only 1 in 5 were at a high risk. Although arguably you could say that the 22% is still a high number of leaders at high risk of burnout. But for us, this was surprising given the amount of responsibility that a chief executive has. They expressed a higher degree of calmness and energy and lower anxiety than their colleagues. But when we were trying to understand perhaps why they felt that they were at a lower risk of burnout than their colleagues, we mused on the idea that it could have something to do with control. So while, yes, they ultimately hold the final accountability for the success and survival of their business, they also have full control. And we know that when you lose control, that can be a derailer and that can be a real trigger for stress. So as you move down the hierarchy, you lose, although you still have significant responsibility, you have less control. There you also have more access to perhaps the struggles of your colleagues. So you might have individuals within your team that are needing to be put on furlough or are not being put on furloughs and are covering, taking up the slack of a reduced capacity. So they might have more contact with some of those real challenges that can be causing a huge amount of stress. These are just a couple of theories. And when we looked at other contributing factors, we drew out some conclusions around both psychological and situational factors. You wouldn't be surprised that those who scored higher on our resilience scale also scored at the lower end of the burnout scale. When we looked at leadership style, those who naturally adopted a more democratic style of leadership adapted more comfortably to remote working and remote leadership than those who were more hands-on and perhaps authoritarian in their approach. You wouldn't be surprised to learn that we also discovered that those who were being managed by those autocratic leaders also struggled in terms of their mental health. This point around self-efficacy and confidence, we noticed that those who had high levels of personal confidence were also at a lower risk of burnout and less likely to be disengaged with work. And we had similar findings in social support. So those who were well supported were less likely to be disengaged and also less likely to feel exhausted. When we looked at situational factors, it was interesting to look at the individual relationship with the business. So length of service refers to the time spent in an organization. And here we noticed that those who were perhaps fresher into the organization, they were green, they coped better, they were at a lower risk of burnout than those who'd been in the organization for 4 or more years, who were far higher when it came to disengagement with work than those who were newer. And you might think that, you might have some conclusions around why that might be. Perhaps if you were fresher into the organization, you've got more to prove, so you're going to go that extra mile. You're still trying to develop a reputation for yourself. So you have some intrinsic motivation there. When we looked at time spent in role, we noticed that those who had been in their roles for longer than a year were more likely to feel disengaged than those who'd been in their role less than a year. And that was interesting because we've had lots of conversations around ability to build and strengthen relationships without the face-to-face contact. And if you've been in your role for less than a year, you've had less time, you would imagine, to build strong relationships with your team. So that was a little bit of a surprise, maybe. And we also asked questions around employment status, and the majority of our participants were working their contracted hours or more than their contracted hours on full pay, with just under a third of our participants taking pay cuts. And this is probably unsurprising, but those whose contracts were unaffected, so they didn't take reductions in hours or pay cuts, they were at the lowest risk of burnout. If we then move on to coping strategies, at the very beginning of lockdown, we ran 2 webinars where we talked about different strategies, and we shared advice on what might help you lead through lockdown, sharing insights both from David and Patrick, our co-founders, and also the School for CEOs faculty. And in that, we also shared these tools and tips that Public Health England published right at the beginning of lockdown. So these were 14 strategies that you might consider implementing to help you get through the challenges of isolation. So we were interested to see how many of these tools and tips our leaders had connected with. And here you can see them listed in order of popularity. Right at the top, connecting with others, finding that human contact to replace the face-to-face was the #1 priority, closely followed by getting outside and bringing nature in, and then physical well-being. And physical well-being refers to aspects such as walking, running, exercise, but it also includes more holistic aspects such as yoga, meditation, and mindfulness. So when connecting with others was the most popular theme, we were interested to know who leaders were connecting with, and specifically who was helping leaders lead through lockdown. And here it was really interesting to learn that actually leaders were leaning more on personal connections rather than professional connections. And these findings became more interesting, we felt, when we broke it down by executive level. So you can see our findings here. There's quite a lot of data on these next couple of slides, but don't worry, because all of these graphs are screen grabs of our report, which you will receive a copy of after the webinar. So what we noticed firstly was that pattern of personal over professional connections was mirrored across executive levels, so the CEO, the executive, and their teams. But we also noticed a trend here around managing up. So functional and divisional leaders, ExCo -1, 51% of them were leaning heavily on their line managers, who would be the executive teams. Similarly, 51% of executive leaders were leaning on the CEO, who naturally would be their line manager. And then 41% of CEOs were also looking to their board for support, who would be their equivalent of managing up. You can also see when looking at the CEO data that 34% of them were also leaning and finding close allies in their HR director. And anecdotally, we've had lots of conversations with HR directors around throughout lockdown, and this is an executive leader that's particularly stretched during lockdown, and they've had some very significant challenges to navigate, but including the transition to remote working, supporting leaders with their workforce with their mental health, and also managing furlough, among other things, certainly. So we've looked at who leaders were engaging with and reaching out to for support, but what specifically were they, what resources were they drawing on? You might not be surprised to see colleague networks right up at the top here with 66%. It was our most popular, given the emphasis on connecting with others that we've just discussed. After that, nearly 40% of leaders were actively engaging in webinars. And actually, when we bolt together all of the online learning opportunities, so webinars, online training and virtual workshops, e-learning and virtual coaching, we found that 57% of the participants in our study actively engaged in one or more of these online structured learning opportunities. So it was really encouraging to see that leaders were not becoming introverted, and that they were actively seeking out opportunities to learn and grow and seeking that support outside of these personal connections. When we looked at resources drawn upon by executive level, we also made some interesting findings. So firstly, anecdotally, we've been having conversations with our clients, HR directors in particular, who have been the driving force behind a lot of the initiatives that are set up in order to support their teams and their leaders and the workforce throughout lockdown. And quite early on, they expressed concerns about their leaders not engaging in these activities. But it was great to see that actually that fear was not true, and that leaders have been actively engaging in the opportunities provided by the organisation. Particularly, it was great to see 72% of CEOs were actively engaging in colleague networks. And this is a fantastic opportunity for the CEO to engage and connect with the organisation at all levels. It gives you an opportunity, I think, to be part of the gang, and that visibility is more important during a crisis than ever. So it's great to see so many taking up that opportunity. Looking at the data, we also noticed that twice as many CEOs were taking up coaching than executive teams and divisional leaders. And webinars appeared to be the most popular learning platform for these leaders. So we're not out of the woods yet, and a lot of uncertainty still remains ahead. So we feel that within that context, the recommendations that we came up with following the research conducted in lockdown are still absolutely relevant. The first one we would encourage you to do is to continue to manage inwards. And that means really considering your physical and emotional needs as an individual. Also, stay connected with your organization, but stay connected with others both inside and outside the organization. Empower others. We found that, as I've already shared, those who had a higher sense of self-efficacy and self-confidence were at a lower risk of burnout. So help others by helping them develop this confidence. McKinsey talked a lot about the democratization of decision-making during lockdown and how decision-making has been devolved as a result of lockdown. So if you can enable this and empower others to make these decisions, it will enable you to be more adaptable and to make decisions faster as a business. Think about supporting individuals. And don't presume to understand others' experience. So understand what their individual needs are and support those. And finally, engage virtually. And that means both social and structured learning. So we have a great opportunity to replace coffee machine catch-ups with something else, and to forge new relationships and to be more inclusive as organizations. So that concludes the presentation of our data and our recommendations. And I'd love to introduce David and Mioara back into the conversation now. Hopefully you can hear me, I can see you. Perhaps I could start, Mioara, by asking you, you know this data better than any of us, having done the hundreds of ANOVAs and reports and runs of different tests. So what surprised you most about the findings?
Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Gemma. In terms of the results, I agree. I must know the data by heart by now. So that's a nice feeling to have, knowing that you control everything. So that, well, when you talk about the data, you have a good understanding of what our findings were. I think there are two different and rather separate issues that surprised me the most. As a researcher, I think one of the things that surprised me the most was related to the age differences, or the kind of results that we got in terms of age differences. Having looked at quite a lot of previous studies that looked into age differences in burnout, I've noticed that most of these, I mean, the results are never conclusive, in the sense that you will always get rather different results, but most of the studies tend to suggest that there's a bimodal relationship between burnout measures and age, in the sense that burnout tends to have higher levels in both younger but also older workers. So we could say that the middle-aged adults are the ones that are more protected, whereas young people and older workers are at risk, because they're the ones that usually, the younger ones are the eager ones, the ones that do their best to kind of impress, because they're at the beginning of their career. So they get very involved, very passionate about it. So they're more likely to maybe experience more exhaustion. And similarly, older workers as well, they tend to have different challenges that makes it more difficult for them to maybe face all the different tasks and responsibilities. So these are the kind of results that previous studies have suggested. And by contrast, other studies have suggested that actually older workers experience more burnout. And that's not the case in our research. I think this is the very interesting result, is that our younger participants are the ones that are at higher risk of burnout. And I think one of the reasons why we do found this, and it's more interesting, is that in previous studies, they didn't look at confounding variables or other variables that could explain why younger or older people might experience burnout. Whereas we were very clear from the beginning that we were going to try and look into the personal space and the managing of the personal space, and whether people had a partner living with them, whether they had children living with them, whether those children were adults or they were children, school-aged adult children, whether there were some responsibilities that came with having children, school children at home, and so on. And I think one of the reasons that our results suggested that, as you clearly pointed it out, was related to the fact that, unlike older workers, in the current context, younger people were more at risk, because they were usually more, they tended to be more responsible of potential school-aged children, and that meant homeschooling them in many cases. And in some situations, that also suggested that we had younger children taking care of their older parents as well, within larger houses. Therefore, obviously, that increased the responsibilities. So I think this is the one result that I found quite interesting, and it came as contrary to what most of the previous research had mentioned. But also, this is from a research point of view, but from a personal point of view, I think another thing that surprised me very much was the resourcefulness that people show even in situations of crisis. And keep in mind that we collected this data in July, early July. If I remember correctly, we started collecting early July, and we finished by almost end of July. And I think we were already in 4-5 months in lockdown, and it was so impressive to see the different resources that people had found in terms of coping with the situation, in terms of being aware of the difficult tasks that most of them had, balancing work and personal life, managing their employees, making sure that they stay afloat, making sure that they still had jobs. And yet at the same time, they found resources to combat potential burnout, potential exhaustion. And I think you've mentioned some of the, aside from the personal resilience, which is more of a psychological trait, but also, all the, what I call the mindfulness practices, which there's a large body of research suggesting that mindfulness practices tend to decrease the level of stress and the burnout. And I think in our situation, to see people saying, well, I've started going out and run, I started doing meditation, I discovered yoga, I started taking care of my physical health, I started trying to sleep better or have a more hygienic sleep routine. I think all those resources, speaking to other people, doing coaching, looking into webinars, all those resources and all those strategies were quite impressive. So kind of maybe intuitively, people realized that they needed to take care of themselves, and they found good strategies to do so.
Thank you. David, if I put the same question to you, what surprised you about the findings?
Yeah, the one stat that really stood out for me was the fact that 25% of women took full responsibility for homeschooling. And I think when we dug into that a little bit deeper, it wasn't because they were single mothers, they were in partnerships. And so for them to take that, 1 in 4 women to take full responsibility and not share that responsibility, I thought was quite staggering, and perhaps contributed to the slightly higher impact of burnout or emotional exhaustion that you talked about when you were going through the data, Gemma. I mean, I was really minded of Caroline Criado Perez's book, Invisible Women, where the first chapter talks about the amount of invisible hours that a woman contributes to the household when she's cooking meals, looking after children, et cetera, et cetera. When you overlay that with, the educational responsibilities that were thrust on families with school-aged children during lockdown, I was really staggered that more partners, and I'm in brackets men, I'm assuming most of them would perhaps be male partners, didn't actually step in and share some of that responsibility. So that was the one that really stood out for me.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting when we then looked below at the shared responsibility for homeschooling, it did start to level out. So it was between 45 and 50% of our participants, both women and men, were saying that they took shared responsibility. So that doesn't say that it was a 50-50 sharing of, but yeah, that 25% versus 3% is very, very significant finding, I think, indeed. So I've had a few questions come in, so thank you for sending us those. I'll start at the top. So Patrick, our co-founder, has a question. How can leaders best provide support and model appropriate behaviours for others to follow? David, would you like to answer that one?
Okay, sure. I think that's one of the biggest challenges actually in lockdown, is the transition from physical leadership to virtual leadership. And for that period that you were literally only visible on a screen, I think provided a huge amount of challenges from a leadership perspective. For me, it's I think because we know that leaders cast a very long shadow and are immediately observed when they're walking through the office or greeting the receptionist on the Monday morning or whatever it is, and people pick up the vibes from how that leader is, you don't get that in a digital world and digital environment. So it's a lot more challenging. So I think for me, it's about really dialing up the communications and thinking about how you can communicate throughout the organization. So your point, Gemma, in the presentation where you're looking at the data around leaders connecting and CEOs connecting with colleague networks, I think was a real indicator that they understood the need for as much visibility as they possibly could do to all levels in the organization, whether that was people who are normally on the shop floor or other places, and providing that visibility, dialing up the communication, being really clear about the path that their organizations were on, and re-emphasizing that over and over again. And so for me, it's that communication thing, which, and the more that they can differentiate the media. So if it's not always on a Zoom call or a Teams call or whatever, and if they actually can get out to places, and I'm talking to a number of people who are now making those steps out and being physically present in their organizations as much as they possibly can be, so much the better.
If I can add to that, David, in fact, as you were quite well putting it, previous studies do show that leadership styles that are characterized by the ability of the leader, in this case the CEOs, to engage in clear communication, just like you said, that transparency in terms of communication and active listening, even though it's an online active listening, as well as the empathy with the co-workers and the employees, or the compassion show towards the employees do have been associated with lower incidences of burnout among employees. Mm-hmm. So the research actually backs up all those recommendations and suggestions.
Thank you. If I have another look at the questions, Mioara, can I ask you a question from Catherine? If we fast forward to January, what would you expect to see in these trends?
January, I think, we were, let's say, at least in UK, we were pre-crisis. We never expected that we would close shop for that long. I mean, we didn't expect, first of all, to close shop, let alone that it will be for such a long period of time. I think people were quite wary of what was happening on the international arena. But, in psychology, we always have what we call comparative optimism and the illusion of control. So these are two very interesting concepts, because we always tend to believe that whatever happens to others, it only happens to the others, and there's very little chances that it will happen to us. And if you look back at people's discourses in January, we were, wary of the potential economic consequences that this might have from the perspective of, China having to deal with this issue. But I don't think we were at that stage where we kind of became wary for, caring for our own job security or for the situation in UK. So I'm tempted to believe that the trends would have been significantly different than the kind of results that we had. I'm not saying that we wouldn't have found emotional exhaustion, because burnout, generally speaking, is not necessarily a concept that it's associated with only crisis situations. There's quite a wide range of studies looking into burnout within different categories of employees. And we target most of the times, or frequently in studies, we target health workers, educators, people that have direct contact with other people. So I'm pretty sure, depending on where we would have conducted the study, there would have been some levels of burnout expressed by different categories, but I don't think at this level. I think, the 42% is quite a high level, and I think it definitely relates to to the lockdown, to the pressures, to the fear, to the unknown, particularly the unknown.
Thank you. We've had a comment from Anne. As a coach of senior managers and exec, I've noticed a significant difference in impact and coping between those with children at home and those without. Also, the gender difference is clear, i.e. women taking burden of education work. Over 50s more likely not to have that additional factor in their world. So kind of linking our findings around homeschooling with the findings we had around age.
Yes, I think, when it comes to gender, there's a wide variety of studies, and there's one meta-analysis in particular that I've looked at where they've tried to look at the results that we got from 183 studies. And what those studies revealed was that women are slightly more emotionally exhausted than men, generally speaking. And that has nothing to do with the lockdown, but rather, generally speaking, we see that there's that emotional exhaustion that comes into play more frequently among women than men. And as David was pointing out, a lot of the times that can be explained by the caring responsibilities. In fact, I personally was involved in some studies looking at social representations within of dementia and how people relate to the dementia concept, but also how different people having taken care of a person with dementia or not might react to different stereotypes that people have towards dementia. Anyway, the idea behind it is that in most of the cases, we will notice that women are more likely to be the caregiver, independently of whether we're talking about children, homeschooling children, independently of whether we're talking about a sick parent, a sick brother, a sick sister. In most of the cases, women are the primary figure of, the primary caregiver, and that in itself obviously has an impact. The fact that in our study, younger people and younger women were more affected is actually a reflection of them having to take care of the children, of course. We looked at over 50s, and we've noticed that in a lot of the cases, even though people over 50s mentioned living with school-aged children, in most of those cases, those were grandchildren. And as such, they were not necessarily responsible for homeschooling them. Therefore, not having that burden may have acted as a protective factor against feeling even more exhausted. I hope that answers Anne's question.
Thank you. David, perhaps I could pose a question to you. Here's a question from Michael Wiley. I talked of creating the coffee machine chat using virtual resources, but many people in my teams complain of being exhausted by endless back-to-back Zoom or Teams calls and are wary of accepting yet another chat invitation, especially from the boss. Oops, where's it gone?
In the dismissed.
Oh, no, the questions.
Oh, the answered one, I think.
Here it is. Apologies. So they're wary of accepting another invitation for a chat, particularly from the boss, and these tend to last longer and be more awkward than the physical 5-minute coffee machine chat. So do you have any suggestions as to how to best handle that, as I agree conceptually with the need to provoke the ad hoc pressure valve release moments?
Yeah, I think it's a really tough question to answer in reality, because those informal conversations are really valuable. I did a piece of work with a client organization with a team about 3 weeks ago when we were still allowed to meet, and we were socially distanced in a large boardroom, but the energy that was there, not only in the meeting itself, but in the conversations that were taking place as we were walking to refresh coffees or go to the loo or whatever it was, you could see all those informal ad hoc conversations taking place. And I think in a virtual world, it is really tough. So I think there's one thing, it's really important to differentiate your work time and your workspace and your physical space. when you're working from home. So, and even if you are struggling in a one-bedroom flat or a studio flat, to differentiate the start time of work, making sure you stop and you have an hour or half an hour or 3/4 of an hour for lunch and a break, and making sure that you stop at whatever time it is in the evening, 5:30, 6 o'clock, whatever time your working hours are, and that you put things away and clear away, and you have your social and your home time. And I think when you're managing your diary, it is very easy to allow the temptation to go from a 1 o'clock Zoom call to a 2 o'clock to a 3 o'clock to a 4:30 and so on. And because everybody knows that you're there, that time is taken up and people will invade your diary. So I think there's a couple of things that you can do. One is to insist that your meetings are limited to 40 minutes, so that you give yourself 20 minutes out of the hour to refresh yourself, have a cup of coffee or do whatever. And the other thing is to be quite disciplined about your diary and not accept invitations to absolutely everything. Because there is sometimes that temptation to want to feel busy. And if you've got a full back-to-back diary, then you get that sense of self-satisfaction, and you're important and you're busy and you're needed and you're required, and all of these sorts of things. Whereas actually, you're going to be much more productive if you're really focused for a 40-minute period and you go out and have some fresh air, or indeed you pick up the phone and call someone. And I think we've resorted to Zoom, Teams, Skype, whatever, and forgotten that actually having a chat on the telephone is as uplifting and as good to connect with people and have the informal conversations. So flip and change the media in which you're communicating would be another thing I'd say.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's something more spontaneous about picking up the phone and having a number that kind of recreates some of that that kind of passing someone in a corridor type feel. I don't know where the time's gone. We've got 5 minutes left, and I've got time to ask a couple of questions, but I'm also going to launch a poll, which you're welcome to take part in. And this is to just share if you're interested to have a follow-up conversation with a member of the team about some of the study that we've done, about possible webinars or other opportunities. So feel free to participate in that if you're interested. Dave, I'd like to ask another question, perhaps to both of you, around actually how do we harness the benefits of the remote working? So this is a question from Lynn. How do executive leaders role model ways of working for the future and not just slip back into the ways we worked before, i.e. being 100% in the office? And perhaps you'd both like to answer this one. David, would you like to go first?
Well, I think Lynn's hit the nail on the head in her question, because it is about role modeling. I know lots of organizations are reviewing their requirements for office space at the moment. They're surveying their colleagues to get a sense of how much time they want to spend in the office and whether they want to change the way of working if and when we're allowed to return to an office environment. And I think it is very much about walking the talk. So if the consensus in your organization is that you want to get a different balance of how you work, then you've got to reflect that. And there was a great example in terms of counteracting a culture of presenteeism in a business, where a CEO, there had been a very much, if your jacket was on your chair at 8:30 and you were still in the office at night, that was great. And the CEO of this particular organization had young children, and he made a point of leaving at 5:15, 5:30 at the absolute latest to be able to get home, to put his kids in the bath and read them a story, and then he might sort of reconnect afterwards. And as he started doing that, it became acceptable for everyone else. And what he discovered was, by 5:45, the office was empty. And interestingly, the productivity of those people in the office went up. So there is something about really walking the talk. If you believe in changing the way of working, then as a leader and as a CEO, do it.
Thank you. Mioara, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, I think one of the things that, I mean, I think aside from the negative psychological impact that we can definitely see in terms of the lockdown, I think there are aspects of the lockdown that have completely changed the way we think about work, particularly in terms of that presenteeism that David was mentioning. And I think it also shifted people's, particularly CEOs or leaders of organizations, it shifted their trust. Because I remember the first weeks of the lockdown, there seemed to be a meeting every other second or an email, purely because, and I felt it as an employee myself, but also I've heard it in discussions with other people. It felt like, you know, I was being controlled to make sure that just by sitting at home, I'm still doing my job. And as a result of that, you know, it kind of created a little bit of a, you know, worry that people thought just because you were staying home, it meant that you weren't necessarily working. But having been through several months of lockdown, I think people have finally started to understand that in some situations, and I'm not suggesting that we should all just start working from home all the time, but there are situations where we could agree on a balance between having 1 or 2 days working from home and then a couple of other days working from your office, if you have the type of job that that is possible and is allowed, with the understanding that a professional space can be created and can be provided for those people to work from home. I remember when I started working from home, I mean, Gemma used to be all the pillows because I was all the time on my couch. I didn't have all the materials, and I felt a little bit frustrated because I didn't feel like I could do my job properly. But now that, you know, I've moved into a space that I can actually call my office, I feel like that in itself allowed me to be able to make that balance, to limit that professional and personal space. And I think, you know, we're going to move more and more towards a working model where it is okay for me to be in the office for 2 or 3 days a week, and then it is okay for me to work from home, and my leader or the CEO of my company will actually trust that as I'm staying home those days, I do my job and I'm efficient and I'm productive. I think that's very important. I think the lockdown kind of created those opportunities for some of us. I mean, as a researcher, we always get that working from home day whenever we can. But I think for many people, that pressure of being every day at work, being the first to come to office, leaving the last, just to kind of prove that you're serious, you're committed to your work. I think we lifted that pressure, and I think that's very important, and that's going to have an impact on spaces, on how we divide spaces at work, on how much space will we consider. It might be that, you know, we're not going to need an entire building for 140 employees. We might just need to have a good shift or a good understanding of who's going to be in the office at what time, and then even that could change.
Thank you. There's been lots of questions today, and we haven't had a chance to get to all of them, but I'm very conscious that we've overrun by 2.5 minutes. So thank you very much for your participation and for staying with us the length. A huge thank you to Mioara and David for your discussion and your insights. And we hope to stay in touch with all of you. And if there's anything we can do to support you, please do reach out. Thank you and have a fantastic weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gemma.